colleagues already in the back, if you want to move over. So, my name is Jorge Duani. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute here at FIU, which is sponsoring today's lecture. And I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Don Walicek. But before I do that, let me just remind you that tonight, Dr. Walicek will be presenting his book, co-edited volume, Guantánamo, An American Empire, The Humanities Respond, which is on the same topic as his talk today. That's tonight at 6:30 at Books and Books, and there are flyers in front. So just briefly to introduce our speaker, Dr. Walicek is an associate professor of English and linguistics at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, where he also is director of the graduate studies program in linguistics, as well as the editor of the fine Caribbean Studies journal, Sargasso. Don has been a visiting scholar at the University of Chicago, University of Michigan, and New York University, among other places. He earned his PhD in English at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, and he also holds an MA in Latin American Studies and a BA in Social Anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin. He specializes in a number of fields in social linguistics, language ideologies, Creole studies, and Caribbean history. And looking at your resume, I was impressed by the large number of places where you've done field work throughout the Caribbean, including Anguilla, Cuba, Curacao, Jamaica, St. Croix, and St. Kitts, as well as in Honduras and Egypt. If you want to talk about that part of your work as well. And he has also lectured widely in many places, including the Caribbean, Latin America, the United States, Europe, and Africa. So I guess you could call him a traveling scholar. He's also the author of many articles, book chapters, and reviews about the topics that he's been working on: language, history, social life in the Caribbean. And these articles have been published in prestigious journals such as Sargasso, Caribbean Studies, Language, the Journal of Pidgin and Creole Studies, the Journal of English Linguistics, Critical Discourse. He is the author of a forthcoming book, which I think is based on your doctoral dissertation, titled Pathways of Language and Difference in Anguilla, Contextualizing Origins and Social History. And today's talk, of course, is part of his book promotion tour on Guantánamo, An American Empire, and I'm sure he's going to be referring to this project. So welcome all, and welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the Cuban Research Institute for the invitation to present here today. It's nothing less than an honor to be here. A special thanks to Dr. Jorge Duani for the initial invitation. As you can see, my presentation is about Guantánamo. The title is The Magnetic Pool of Guantánamo Bay, Responding to Violence with Hope. Later tonight I'll be presenting this volume. It's an edited volume at Books and Books. This volume came out about 6 months ago. It's called Guantánamo, An American Empire, The Humanities Respond. Why Guantánamo? I've been working on this Guantánamo project for about 4 or 5 years now. I kept hearing about Guantánamo as someone interested in the Caribbean, about on the news and in the newspaper and on the internet, sometimes really amazing, horrific stories that were difficult to believe. And I noticed that there weren't a lot of people in Caribbean studies writing about Guantánamo or discussing these events. Most of the people were from law and also sociology, other fields, but not from Caribbean studies and not from the humanities. I initially thought that the humanities have a lot to contribute to resolving problems and issues around Guantánamo, and that the humanities could function as a platform for dialogue. And another reason I became interested in Guantánamo is I began teaching text in my classes written by prisoners and refugees and other people that had been in the base, and my students were incredibly interested in that. So it made sense to pursue this topic. Now that I have the edited volume done, I would like to begin a new project. And so this presentation today will give you an idea of what that project is. That project will focus on two concepts, language and the notion of freedom. The project will establish two narratives. And one of the narratives will look at how people's rights have been restricted in Guantánamo, or people's lives, how people's lives have been contained, especially within the US naval base. The base has a long history of confining people and incarcerating people, these sorts of things. I will tell you about that. And then the other narrative, which I will intertwine, will look at what these people have done, right? The victims of abuse in some case, or the people inside refugee camps, which in the 1990s included tens of thousands of Cubans and Haitians. What did these people do? Writing was very important to them, painting was very important to them, poetry was very important to them. And in this work, they often discuss freedom. Okay? And so that's one level of the humanities operating on the ground, also through song, okay? Another level of the humanities operating around Guantánamo can be seen in what their advocates did. For example, when Haitians were in the base in the 1990s, people throughout the United States and various Haitian communities organized. And they organized plays, some of them recorded music, fundraising events, and in all of these instances, they talked about what was going on in Guantánamo Bay. So these are part of a larger archive that I will engage in this future project. I'm talking about Guantánamo as a site of conscience. The site of conscience is a place of memory. It can be a historic site, a museum, or a memorial. It prevents erasure from happening in order to ensure a more just and humane future. That's the general definition. It can be a virtual site, or it can actually be an exhibit, or something like this. I've talked to other researchers in other parts of the world, and we're trying to collaborate about doing something together, right? Creating something online eventually. That's probably going to be our final goal, and it would include some of the archives that I just mentioned to you. Okay, so this is Guantánamo Bay. Everyone here has heard about Guantánamo at some moment, I assume, but not everyone really understands what's going on when you look at the map. So I'll explain it to you. You see a peach-colored part, right, at the bottom, that's enclosed by straight lines. That's the part of the bay that is occupied by the US military. It's been occupied since 1898. In 1898, the United States sent troops to Cuba to help Cubans in their struggle for independence from Spain, right? To keep it simple. The Americans had been dreaming of occupying the bay for decades, way before 1898. They had even devised geopolitical strategies with the goal of occupying the bay in mind. The British had also dreamed of occupying the bay. George Washington's brother in the 18th century had went to the bay to scope it out and to imagine having it as part of US empire. So this is a coveted space. Why is it coveted? It's a very deep bay, right? That's one reason. And it's also which allows ships to go inside and to be protected. And it's also located in an isolated part of Cuba. So foreign powers imagine that they could be there without attracting too much attention from Havana. It's also in the eastern tip of Cuba, which you can maybe get a sense of in that blurry map to the right. Okay, this is the southern coast, of course, and the Windward Passage is there. So from this spot, A foreign power like the United States could monitor what's going on in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, most of the Caribbean, and also monitor traffic to the Panama Canal. All of these things were important and make this a special place. So these geographical features set the stage for highly charged political, economic, and social forces that over time have spawned questions about ethics, sovereignty, and the law. It's almost as if controversy, abuse, and resistance line up in the direction of the Bay, as if a magnetic force organized them in a circular path. So there's so many events in Guantanamo Bay over time. Important historical events are overrepresented. That's one of the main points that I'm going to make today, and I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. One more thing about the bay in this map. This is an international border, right? There's no real movement. There's no movement, I'm gonna say, between Cuba and the base, okay? And that was different in the 1950s. The part of Cuba surrounding Guantanamo Bay is a province with what name? Guantanamo, right? So it gets very confusing when people talk about Guantanamo. What's Guantanamo? And then there's a capital of the province called what? Guantanamo City, right? So there are multiple Guantanamos. And then you hear people like Barack Obama, the former president, saying close Guantanamo. What is he talking about? Is he talking about closing the base? No, he was talking about closing the prison, right? But he wasn't really talking about closing the prison, he was just talking about emptying the prison. But that wouldn't have been a good campaign promise, right? So these are important issues. As I suggested, the Bay is a site of resistance against imperial power. For example, in the earliest period of colonialism, the space surrounding Guantanamo Bay provided ground for indigenous resistance to the incursions of Spain, including conversion to Christianity and battles over labor and land. The story of the cacique, Atuey, is replete with examples of the use of physical violence to control those whom the Spanish professed to set free. In 1511, Atuey, who you can see here in this memorial, fled Hispaniola because their colonial authorities were establishing a new land system that basically enslaved the indigenous people. He resisted the Spaniards there, but eventually he realized that he couldn't defend himself, and so he fled to Cuba. What did the Spaniards do? They followed him, okay? Where did he enter Cuba? Through Guantanamo Bay. They told him that he had to be baptized. He refused to baptize himself, or he refused to be baptized, and that he was burned at the stake. So in the eastern part of Cuba today, Atuey is an important figure. One reason for that is that he's remembered in folklore and stories and other types of writing. Much of this writing presents him as an anti-imperialist. Okay, so there you can see the humanities operating alongside memory, institutional memory. Who do we have here? This is Thomas Jefferson, okay, in the 18th century. As you probably know, Jefferson is the principal author of the US Declaration of Independence and the country's third president. He championed a vision of economic prosperity and moral virtue that was dependent on something he called an empire of liberty. What was this? This was a system of equal and reciprocal federated states that would extend into the Caribbean and require control of Guantanamo Bay. Jefferson was very enthusiastic about this, but when everyone else became enthusiastic, he became hesitant. He grew concerned that his country would no longer be able to control itself, and it would emerge as a dictator of the world. His warnings about the nation's integrity and future security were not heeded, however. Indeed, the country's paternalistic vision of moving forward intensified in ways that challenged the freedom of its Caribbean neighbors, as suggested by the 1823 policy declaration that became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Moving ahead to another event that underscores the importance of the Bay, the Atlantic slave trade. Significant events in the Atlantic slave trade also cluster around Guantánamo Bay. For example, the United States and Great Britain banned the international trade of slaves in 1807. This is before slavery itself was abolished, right? This was a law saying that slaves could no longer be transported. But government officials and an international network of agents conspired to utilize the bay to illegally import thousands of Africans through its waters. With all of the formations and places to hide and the deep nature of the bay, this was a strategic site. In 1857, a correspondent for New York's Weekly Herald described the bay as, I quote, a favorite harbor for the off-landing of cargoes of Negroes from Africa, and its numerous bays and inlets, surrounded and separated from each other by high hills, enabled the slavers to discharge their cargoes in perfect security, end quote. Extremely lucrative for a large number of US investors and companies, this trade was condoned by local officials and North American merchants in blatant disregard for the law. These photos come from the Spanish-American War, 1898, the event that I mentioned a second ago. On the left here, you see a flag being raised. This is in Guantánamo Bay. The day before this flag was put up, there was a Spanish flag there, which these men burned. You can read some of the diaries of the officers who participated in this event. So the Spanish-American War was not yet over. This is part of the Battle of Guantánamo. Nevertheless, the US flag obviously is going up. This is the image, and it's also on the cover of our edited volume. Okay, let's see. The Americans also celebrated their destruction of the cable station at the harbor's entrance, elated that it eliminated communication between the Spanish and Haiti. On the third day, soldiers burned a small village nearby and established a military camp there, naming it in honor of their leader, Micala. The name Camp Micala would endure. Roughly a century later, it was assigned to the larger of two emergency tent cities built for tens of thousands of Haitian asylum seekers that the US military detained there. Excuse me. You may have heard about the detention of Haitians in the camps in the 1990s, which was in the base. Has anyone heard of this? So refugees have rights to be free from persecution, right? If a refugee enters a country, the country is usually obligated to provide him or her with certain protections. In the 1990s, the United States did not provide Haitians with these protections. Some Haitians were forcibly repatriated. They were sent back to Haiti. In addition, the process by which their circumstances were decided was a very quick one. Sometimes it was done on boats. Sometimes it was done without translators. It wasn't a responsible way of handling the influx of people. There were also people who were put in the base who were just simply trying to pass by Cuba, right? Maybe they were going to Central America or somewhere else, and the Coast Guard captured them and put them in Guantánamo Bay. It was also a public relations disaster for the United States, okay? Because a lot of people spoke out on behalf of the Haitians, including very prominent movie stars and college students from elite institutions like Georgetown, Harvard, and Yale started going on rolling hunger strikes. Okay, so this was really difficult for the military. I always thought that the special policy, the exceptional policy for Haitians began in the 1990s. And in a way it did, but in another way it didn't. I will explain. About a decade after the base was established, the Americans used the base operations to monitor domestic affairs in Haiti and the political activities of Haitian exiles in other parts of the Caribbean, such as Jamaica, as well as in the United States. The US government's position on the security of the Caribbean was that its commercial and political influence in the region was threatened by cycles of rebellion and insurrection in Haiti, where intense rivalries associated with attempts to gain power included armed revolts and frequent attempts to overthrow the government. Americans in high-level positions in the US government associated these problems with Haiti's culture, internal weaknesses, and its failed institutions. US politicians, statesmen, and people like Frederick Douglass, who's a former ambassador to Haiti, decided that one way of attacking this problem, attacking the instability, was to eliminate protections for Haitian asylum seekers. They argued that the law and practices that ensured routes to safety for political insurgents and revolutionaries had facilitated attacks on the Haitian government, thereby increasing the overall instability and putting the US at risk. So the idea was, well, since there's this refugee policy, lots of people will challenge the government because they know that if they're not successful, they'll be granted refugee status and they can go to Mexico or France or something like that. So the American policy was no asylum, no hearing for Haitian refugees, no matter what. The new policy was instituted in Haiti in 1908 with military support from Guantánamo Bay. The US prohibited its consular representatives from providing asylum even to those Haitians who feared for their lives, announcing that it would no longer provide them with temporary protection or passage to safety outside the country. Significantly, US companies that had recently secured lucrative contracts in Haiti in the areas of agriculture, finance, and railroad construction were active in lobbying for this. On January 18, 1908, the new policy was put to the test when the USS Eagle abruptly left Guantanamo Bay, proceeding at full speed to St. Mark, Haiti, in response to attempts to overthrow the government of President Nord Alexis. Shortly after its arrival in port, the ship's commanding officer, George Marvel, went ashore to see the American consular general. Exchanges of gunfire echoed nearby, and looted zones stood ablaze as Marvel shook the hands of refugees, both government and rebel. Marvel explained that the Americans were prepared to protect only American, British, Cuban, and Puerto Rican subjects who were in grave danger, specifically those being chased by a mob, and that they would provide them with transport to Guantanamo Bay if necessary. Marvel's instructions also established that the US expected those Haitians that it was already protecting to leave the places of sanctuary that it had made available. The new policy had dire consequences and would soon be supported by US allies. Within 2 weeks of Marvel's arrival from Guantanamo Bay, the Haitian refugees at St. Mark were seized from the American consulate by Haitian government troops, taken to a nearby cemetery, and summarily executed on suspicion of supporting the rebellion. Similar executions took place in Gonaives and in Port-au-Prince. The targets were Haitian rebels, but among the dead were suspected supporters as well as individuals in government positions, including some accused of sympathizing with the insurrectionists. They included police, military officers, party affiliates, municipal officials, and their family members. In some cases, the children and siblings of those suspected of rebellion were also killed. So this shows a much longer history in terms of US exceptional policy towards Haitian refugees. I don't think that this policy necessarily served as a model for the policy that emerged in the 1990s. I have no evidence of that, and my guess is that's not the case. What I do see though is that a lot of the logic that ruled decision making around Haitians and asylum issues didn't change that much between the early 20th century and the 1990s. This is a list of the various countries that have been occupied or invaded from Guantánamo Bay. It's an impressive list. You could imagine the way in which these actions changed Caribbean history, changed Latin American history, changed how people saw themselves in the relationship with the United States, how they imagined the future. Another thing that could be researched is how these invasions from Guantánamo Bay were represented in the literary traditions and poetic traditions of all of these countries. Okay, the 18th century hubris that envisioned empire as a powerful force of good still haunts Guantánamo. The notion that liberty and freedom could emanate from and be part and parcel of empire seems to sum up the tension between then and now, between us and them, that informs the site as a whole. At Guantánamo Bay, the 18th century is not long past. The concept of America that was coming into being then, with its sense of freedom as a force that could and should impose empire, continues to function, and as always, not particularly well. Here are a few images. You have Cuban refugees on the top right, Haitian refugees on the bottom left, and some images of tent cities. Here you have examples of art that were created in response to the detention of Haitians and Cubans in the camp. Some of these were created by people inside the different camps. The Haitians and Cubans were housed separately and treated quite differently. In very general terms, the Cubans' rights were respected more than those of Haitians. The Cubans had to stay a long time in the base under unacceptable conditions, but the Haitians really had to deal with much more severe realities. And there was another issue. Some of the Haitians were diagnosed as being HIV positive, and the world's first camp for HIV positive people was established, and they were kept in it under very inhumane conditions for a long period of time. If you look at the different situations across time, starting with slavery and a little, well, I would say starting with indigenous, with the interactions between the Spaniards and the indigenous population, you see a common set of technologies of abuse and control, is what I call them here. So the oppressors would do pretty much the same things to the people they're oppressing over time. There's shackling and blindfolding, people are put in cages, people are sold. Some of the men who are in Guantanamo today, there are 40 men there, they were actually purchased by the US military. People are separated from their family members, people are put into solitary confinement, there's various forms of abuse, and people are silenced. In other words, they're not allowed to speak. Just building up on some of these similarities, visually here, it's rather striking, right? That people are hooded both in the 19th century and just a decade or so ago. And here you have the use of cages. We've heard a lot about cages recently with migrants around the Texas border and other parts of the southern border of the United States. You have a cage there in the 18th century in West Africa. A few children from Haiti were put into cages in the 1990s for bad behavior. And then you have an exercise facility on the right, which is not a cage. I took that picture when I visited the prison a couple of years ago, but it certainly looks like a cage. I would say it has a lot of cage-like features. Journalists and other official visitors who have toured the detention facilities in recent years have had first-hand access to structures and objects that are part of prisoners' daily lives, including a chair for forced feeding equipped with straps for the hunger strikers' shoulders. A lot of prisoners have gone on hunger strike. One that is so restrictive that its manufacturer describes it as a padded cell on wheels. Objects associated with recreational privileges and personal liberties earned by cooperative prisoners, though well-behaved, also reflect a hubristic authoritarian confidence. Among these are an outdoor recreational center that was located in the hot sun, that's what I just showed you, and a plush recliner situated between a system of floor shackles and two-way mirrors in a media room where detainees are allowed to watch satellite television. So here on the left, this is the modern prison. This is a section of it that's devoted to communal living, in which 6 to 7 people will live together, and they each have their own cell. The cells are behind those dark brown doors. There's a watchtower on the right. Thinking again about how the past informs the present and how things cycle, right, in circles across time. On the right, you see a lazy boy recliner that reminds me of something my parents have in their living room. This is where prisoners who are designated as having behaved themselves can watch cable TV, satellite TV, play, what do you call it, all these video games that a lot of people want to play. I don't know what they're called. But while they're there, they have to have their legs shackled. So I got down on my hands and knees and looked at the brand of the shackles. These shackles were manufactured by Hyatt & Company, which is based in the UK. Ironically, this same company manufactured shackles that were used in the British slave trade, which included shipments to the Caribbean in the 19th century. So it's the same company. Rather shocking. Once information about this, got out, there were protests, and the company has since been shut down. Okay, I'm gonna read a little bit about what's going on the Cuba side of the border, the international border separating Guantánamo province and the base. This is based on mainly my visits. I've been going now for 3 or 4 years. I've been there 4 or 5 times and conversed with lots of different people, including people who closely follow what's going on in the base and the base's history. Of course, disparate understandings of American values, freedom, and rights are also deeply enmeshed in the political relationship between the United States and Cuba. In Cuba, political dissidents who oppose the current government express some of the same critiques that the US government has identified of places where the detainees come from, including the idea that Cubans are denied the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and other rights. A problem facing the US government, however, is the perception that in its domestic affairs, foreign policy, and military actions, it fails to consistently reflect the very democratic values that it insists should exist within Cuba. For more than 20 years, the General Assembly of the United Nations has adopted a resolution that condemns the US economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba, and that numerous countries oppose the embargo on the grounds that it is un-American. That is, it is an affront to basic freedoms related to trade, governance, and human rights. Representatives of the Cuban government have vocally echoed these claims, occasionally referencing crimes committed within the US base at Guantanamo to buttress the argument that US actions there are unjust and inhumane. For example, in 2006, Cuban Representative Ileana Núñez Morloche argued, I quote, "Those who have been responsible for practices of torture and the most brutal harassment of persons detained at Guantánamo and secret prisons in the Middle East cannot give lessons on human rights. The United States does not qualify as a judge and does not have the moral authority to evaluate any country." Significantly, this is a statement made mainly to an external audience, not Cuba's domestic population. In Janet Littman's recent work on Guantánamo, she analyzes Granma's coverage of the base between 2002 and 2009. This is when the period in which Guantánamo was on the front page of the New York Times 3 or 4 times a week and regularly covered in all the major papers of the world. Littman argues that during this period, Cuba minimized its coverage of the outrageous acts, such as torture, because of allegations it abused high-profile dissidents and prisoners and activists at the same period. So the idea was that Guantánamo was a topic that was somewhat off limits, this is her argument, because it would attract attention to similar processes domestically. Nevertheless, it was not that long ago that everyone I met in Guantánamo somehow felt more optimistic about relations between the United States and Cuba improving. In a visit to the small poblados near the border of the base, people said only Waveworks livestock had recently lost their lives to the deadly landmines. The idea is that people are no longer trying to get into the base and losing limbs, right? So people sort of celebrated this. Because if you made it across the border onto the base, the United States previously would give you refugee status. People also told me that the Cuban state had removed some of the more aggressive of the large, colorful anti-imperialist signs surrounding its military installments along the border. My host mentioned a relatively recent agreement that made Cuban hospitals more available for emergency use by the US military, a small but significant breakthrough considering mutual allegations of human rights abuses and terrorism, as well as controversies involving spying, the US economic embargo, and arguments concerning how each country should pursue its ideas about freedom, governance, and progress. Some suspected the agreement had actually paved the way for the celebrated renewal of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. As these developments suggest, the base has long been defined by social relationships, as well as by shifts within local, national, and international context. For their own reasons, however, Cuba and US authorities seem to share a common interest in limiting access to Gitmo, the base, and the spaces around it. Gaining access to Caimanera, the Cuban town closest to the base, a small port of about 10,000 people who are traditionally dedicated to fishing and salt mining, involves layers of permission and oversight. Proximity to the base has profoundly shaped daily life of the population. Site of the infamous tolerance zones of the 1920s and the 1930s, when droves of US servicemen enjoyed freedoms unavailable back home as a result of prohibition. The zone was exempt from restrictions on alcohol, and sailors and others visited a large number of taverns, cabarets, and brothels, where economically vulnerable Cuban women were exploited as sex workers. Conflicts with base personnel resulted in drunken brawls and even the deaths of civilians. One thing that you'll hear if you visit Guantánamo is you'll hear people say Guantánamo no es la base. Okay, people are very aware that Guantánamo all over the world is associated with the prison and with torture, and they want to turn that around. They don't really have a strategy for doing so, a definite one, right? And so if people know your interest in the base, they're likely to converse with you about this. I had a conversation like this at the Guantánamo Municipal Museum, and people were telling me Guantánamo no es la base, Guantánamo no es la base. I just given a presentation about the base, right, a couple of blocks away. And then we walked in a room and there's this huge model of what? La base, right? And I was like, oh, Guantánamo no es la base. And then they explain, well, Guantánamo no es la base, but this room is under construction. And the walls are empty, as you can see in the photo on the bottom. So I talked to the curators, begun a conversation with them about what could go on the walls, right? Generally, the idea here is the story of the base is one of infraction and violence. So the base has a red light where every martyr died. Okay, you can hit a button and it shows you anytime a Cuban soldier was killed by an American throughout the history of the base. There are quite a few of them. And then there's a legend that explains what happened. Okay. People are not very aware that Haitians were ever in the base, okay, or any of these other patterns, right, that I've shared with you today, these things that kind of repeat over time. People don't have a lot of access to information. That's one of the challenges. But it's also not clear yet that the people who are in charge of this room, which is still under construction, know exactly what sort of narrative that they'd like to create. Okay, just a couple of more things. A lot of poetry has been written by the Muslim detainees who are in the base. A lot of it was published in this book by Mark Falkoff, which was published in 2007 by the University of Iowa. This caused him a lot of problems, and this poetry became somewhat controversial. The book was banned in some context, and some universities said it couldn't be taught in their classrooms, and this sort of thing. So it's interesting to think about, what's so threatening about poetry.
The truth.
Something similar happened with art at an exhibit. Lawyers took art that had been approved for release to an exhibit in John Jay College in New York City, and the US military got wind of it, and they responded by changing policies related to art created within the prison. So now art can no longer be authorized for release, and if a prisoner is released, he cannot take his art with him. It's burned. So it's incinerated. This is a topic that got a lot of attention within the last year. Okay. Poetry and empathy, of course, are dangerous. The men imprisoned in the detention center were allowed to use pens and paper in 2003, but many reported that much of their poetry was routinely confiscated and destroyed, the military turning the act of creation into a kind of Sisyphean labor. The Afghan journalist Abdul Rahim Muslim Dost, one of the most prolific writers among the detainees, composed more than 25,000 lines of verse while he was in prison. Poetry about the power of language, about poetry itself, about his hope of returning to his family and his native land and being with his children. He wrote simply to survive. I quote one of his short poems. I would fly on the wings of my imagination. Through my poems, I would travel the world. Although I was in a cage, I was really free. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Yes.
I just wanted to tell you that this has been so detailed, and I'm thankful for your studies on this. I didn't know. I knew somewhat about, of course, about when the whole influx of the Mariel boat was that there were also Haitians